Continuing my discussion of great works of phenomenology, I come now to Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre, first published in 1943. The principal idea that it advances is that being is never exhausted by any of its phenomenal aspects. No particular perspective reveals the entire character of being. Being in itself, en soi, is fixed, complete, wholly given, absolutely contingent, with no reason for its being. It is roughly equivalent to the inert world of objects and things. Being for itself, pour soi, is incomplete, fluid, indeterminate. It corresponds to the being of human consciousness. Being in itself is prior to being for itself. The latter is dependent upon the former for its origin. Being for itself is derived from being in itself by an act of annihilation. For being for itself is a nothingness in the heart of being. Freedom is the nature of man. In anxiety, man becomes aware of his freedom, knows himself responsible for his own being by commitment, seeks the impossible reunion with being in itself, and in despair knows himself forever at odds with the others, who by their glances can threaten a man, turning him into a mere object. The subtitle of Being and Nothingness is an essay on phenomenological ontology. This subtitle states clearly the central intention of the author. Sartre is at one with Parmenides and Plato in his contention that the chief problem of philosophy is the problem of being. Significant differences, however, emerge in a comparison of the ontological investigations of the ancient Greeks with those of the contemporary Frenchmen. The adjective phenomenological in the subtitle of Sartre's classic indicates one of these significant differences. Sartre's ontology is an ontology that follows in the wake of Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy. Edmund Husserl's phenomenological reduction and Martin Heidegger's ontology of Dasein. Being and Nothingness has all of the Kantian reservations about any philosophy which seeks to proceed beyond the limits of possible experience. Draws heavily from the phenomenological investigations of Husserl and exhibits basically the same form of analysis and description as was used in Heidegger's Being and Time of 1927. Nevertheless, Kant, Husserl, Heidegger intermittently throughout the work fall under some rather transient Sartrean criticism. Kant's chief mistake was his appeal to a thing in itself, which somehow stands behind the phenomena. In Sartre's phenomenological ontology, there is nothing concealed behind the phenomena or the appearances. The appearances themselves embody full reality. They are indicative of themselves and refer to nothing but themselves. The Kantian dualism of phenomena and noumena, appearance and reality, is abolished, and being is made coextensive with phenomena. Husserl comes in for a similar criticism. His hypothesis of a transcendental ego is pronounced useless and disastrous. The fate of such a view, according to Sartre, is shipwreck on the reef of solipsism. The faults of Heidegger are not as grievous as those of Kant and Husserl, as becomes apparent on every page of Being and Nothingness. Sartre's analysis is markedly informed by Heideggerian concepts. Yet Heidegger argues, the author, neglects the phenomenon of the lived body, has no explanation for the concrete relatedness of selves, and misinterprets the existential significance of death. Being, in Sartre's analysis, evinces a transphenomenal character. Although there is no noumena and no thing in itself which lies concealed behind the phenomenal appearances of being, being is never exhausted in any of its particular phenomenal aspects. Being in the totality of its aspects and manifestations never becomes wholly translucent to consciousness. Everything which has being overflows whatever particular categories, designations, and descriptions human knowledge may attach to it. Being evinces relationships and qualities which escape any specific determination. Although being is reduced to the whole of its phenomenal manifestations, it is in no way exhausted by any particular perspective that man has of the phenomena. All phenomena overflow themselves, suggesting other phenomena yet to be disclosed. This primordial being, transphenomenal in character, expresses a fundamental rupture into being in itself, en soi, and being for self, for itself, pour soi. Being in itself designates being in the mode of fullness or plenitude. It is massive, fixed, complete in itself, totally and wholly given. It is devoid of potency and becoming, roughly equivalent to the inert world of objects and things. It has no inside and no outside. It expresses neither a relationship with itself nor a relationship to anything outside of itself. It is further characterized by an absolute contingency. There is no reason for its being. It is superfluous, de trop, uncreated, without reason for being, without connection with any other being. Being in itself is superfluous for all eternity. Being for itself is fluid and vacuous rather than fixed and full. It is characterized by incompleteness, potency, and lack of determinate structure. As being in itself is roughly equivalent to the inert and solidified world of objectified reality, so being for itself generally corresponds to the being of human consciousness. These two modes of being, however, are not granted an equal ontological status. Being in itself is both logically and ontologically prior to being for itself. The latter is dependent upon the former for its origin. Being for itself is inconceivable without being in itself, and is derived from it through an original annihilation, neonticization. Being for itself thus constitutes annihilation of being in itself. Being for itself makes its appearance as nothingness, which lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm. The being of the for itself is the borrowed being which emerges from the in itself by virtue of its power of negation. The source of the power of nothingness remains inexplicable and mysterious. The for itself simply finds itself there, separated and at a distance from the absolute fullness of the in itself. The for itself emerges as an irreducible and ultimate datum. One of the fateful consequences of the primordial rupture of the for itself from the in itself is the introduction of nothingness. Sartre makes it clear that it is through man or human consciousness that nothingness comes into the world. In his discussion on nothingness, Sartre is intent upon rejecting the Hegelian dialectical approach and substituting for it a phenomenological account. For Hegel, being and nothingness are dialectical concepts which take their rise from the same ontological level of mediated reality. A little note by myself here, by the way. You can forget what Sartre says about Hegel, basically, because he gets most of it wrong. But anyway, I'll continue. Sartre maintains in his phenomenological approach that nothingness is dependent upon being in a way that being is not dependent upon nothingness. Nothingness is not an abstract idea complementary to being, nor can it be conceived outside of being. It must be given at the heart of being. Nothingness demands a host, possessing the plenitude and full positivity of being, from which it borrows its power of annihilation. Thus nothingness has only a borrowed or marginal being. Although Sartre never acknowledges his debt to Augustine on this point, his analysis seems to draw heavily from Augustinian sources. Augustine had already described evil as a tendency towards nothingness, the movement presupposing perfect being as a host in which evil exists as a privation of the good. It would indeed seem that in its basic outline, Sartre's analysis of nothingness is little more than a secularized Augustinianism. The introduction of nothingness raises the question of its relation to negative judgments. As Heidegger had done before him, Sartre insists that nothingness is the origin and foundation of negative judgments rather than vice versa. This foundation finds its clarification in the context of human expectations and project. Sartre, as an example, tells of expecting to find a person, Pierre, in a cafe, when in fact he is not present. The expectation of finding Pierre has caused the absence of Pierre to happen as a real event pertaining to the cafe. I discover his absence as an objective fact. I look for him and find that he is not there, thus disclosing a synthetic relation between Pierre and the setting in which I have expected him to be. There obtains a real relation between Pierre and the cafe as distinct from the relation of not being which characterizes the order of thought in simple negative judgments. To make the negative judgment that Pierre is not in the cafe has purely abstract meaning. It is without real or efficacious foundation. We have observed that it is through man that nothingness comes into the world. The question then arises, what is it about the being of man that occasions nothingness? The answer is freedom. The freedom which is here revealed should in no way be identified with a property or a quality which somehow attaches to man's original nature. Freedom is the nature of man. There is no difference between the being of man and his being free. As becomes apparent later in Being and Nothingness, Sartre's ontology of man is a philosophy of radical and total freedom. This consciousness of freedom is disclosed in anxiety. And I quote, "It is in anxiety that man gets the consciousness of his freedom." Or, if you prefer, anxiety is the mode of being of freedom as consciousness of being. It is the anxiety that freedom is in its being, in question of itself. End quote. There is thus an internal connection among nothingness, freedom, and anxiety. These are interrelated structural determinants of the being of man. Nothingness, freedom, anxiety provide the conditions which make possible the movement of bad faith, mauvaise foi. Bad faith is the form of self-deception which, in making use of freedom, denies it. Bad faith is akin to lying, yet not identical with it. In lying, one hides the truth from others. In bad faith, one hides the truth from oneself. In the former, there is a duality of deceiver and deceived. In the latter, there is a unity of a single consciousness. Bad faith does not come from the outside. Consciousness affects itself with it. In describing the pattern of bad faith, Sartre develops the example of a woman who consents to go out with an amorous suitor. She is fully aware of his intentions and knows that sooner or later she will have to make a decision. An immediate decision is demanded. When he caresses her hand, if she leaves her hand there, she encourages his advances. If she withdraws it, she may well preclude any further relationship with the suitor. She must decide, but she seeks means for postponing the decision. It is at this point that bad faith comes into play. She leaves her hand in his, but does not notice that she is doing so. She becomes all intellect, divorces the soul from her body, transforms her body into an object or thing, into the mode of being in itself. Her hand becomes a thing, neither consenting nor resisting. She objectifies her body and ultimately herself, as in itself, and thus stages a flight or an escape from herself as for itself. She loses her subjectivity, her freedom, and her responsibility for decision. She exists in bad faith. The pursuit of being leads to an awareness of nothingness, and nothingness to an awareness of freedom. Freedom to bad faith to the being of consciousness which provides the condition for its possibility. We are thus led to an interrogation of the immediate structures of the forward self as consciousness. The immediate consciousness in which the self-experienced presence is what Sartre calls the non-positional consciousness. This consciousness characterizes the level of primitive awareness and is prior to the positional consciousness, which is the reflective consciousness of the intentional action. Non-positional consciousness is pre-reflective, therefore. Sartre describes it as a pre-reflective cogito. Cogito pre-reflexive. This pre-reflective cogito quite clearly precedes the Cartesian cogito, which is a movement of reflection, and becomes the foundation for it. Positional consciousness, on the other hand, is reflective in character, directed towards some intentional object. Sartre has taken over Husserl's doctrine of intentionality and has made it central to his description of the positional consciousness. Positional consciousness is always consciousness of something. It is directed outward into a world, but the positional consciousness can also be directed reflexively upon itself. Consciousness can become conscious of itself as being conscious. It is in this way that the ego or self is posited or derived. Both the world and the ego or self are posited by the projecting activity of the forward self in its non-positional freedom. And they become correlative phenomena inextricably bound up at their very source. Without the world there is no ego, and without the ego there is no world. Both the world and the ego are hypostasized through reflection as unifying ideal limits.